well. You know, we want to have shop steward organisation. This seems to be working very well for these manufacturing workers. We want the same kind of thing. Workers in the health service, many of them very low paid, very inexperienced and struggle, were beginning to say, well, you know, we're going to get involved in this, we're going to go on strike. And so, you know, oppressed groups like women and to a lesser degree at the time, people of colour, were beginning to take action, and the sorts of demands that workers were struggling around were actually at that point becoming more and more, not so much political in the traditional sense, but saying we want more than what society is offering us at the moment. And they were kind of pushing at the boundaries of society. And I think that, you know, both from a positive and a negative point of view, both when you look at the oppression of women and at the, you know, way that women have always been there in every form of actual struggle and self-activity in the working class, you see that really the position of women is shaped very much by the way that class structure works. So what Clara was saying about the position, you know, what's being done to the migrant workers on the tube and elsewhere, and these vicious, really vicious attacks on them, and these, I remember one of the cases I heard about recently was where some poor woman fell asleep at the end of her shift, which you could hardly blame her for, or I don't think he'd even fallen asleep, but just sat down for a moment, and she was sacked for that. You know, how much worse can this sort of thing get? But again, I think this is the sort of savagery and the viciousness of these attacks are only really, you know, you can only explain them in terms of what capital wants and what capital is determined to get. And these contracting companies who carry out cleaning in places like the Tube and so on, these are, you know, they're paring down their profit margins, well, not their profit margins, but their cost margins to the lowest possible level, and they would just do everything they can to keep costs down. And of course, that means labour costs. And I would like to think that Clara's right, that you know, because the Labour government is supposed to have some sorts of principles about just treatment of people, that if they knew what was happening, they would take steps against this. But unfortunately, the current Labour government is very much based on a market view of the economy and having to maintain, you know, this complete obsession or drive to allow capital to do whatever it needs to do or wants to do in order to be profitable. And it's ironic that even that, you know, basically, you know, how can I put it strongly enough, vindictive approach in terms of favouring capital always at the expense of workers has now ended in a situation where, you know, this government and this capitalist class appears to be helpless in the face of a recession, which has clearly, you know, basically come out of the contradictions within capitalism. But that's getting us a long way from International Women's Day when we talk about that. But I think, you know, what I really feel is that although, of course, I personally always sympathise with the objectives of feminism, I don't think that women's liberation, if you like, can be achieved in the abstract at all. I think that, in fact, women's own struggles have never been carried out in the abstract. They've always, all the most effective and significant struggles have been carried out in the context of the actual experiences of women. And it's quite right to say, as Liz says, there's now actually a slight majority of women in trade unions, which would be a very joyful thing to see, and it is quite historic if it wasn't for the fact that it was caused by the fact that so many more women are doing very, you know, low paid. But at least they are joining unions, and that is a good thing to see. If only unions weren't always like unison, but nevertheless, you know, they're being organised in some way or another. So, you know, it's interesting, I think, that the period I was talking about earlier, the late 60s and early 70s, or in fact right through the 1970s, was generally a period of much greater sort of tolerance and support, even by capitalist governments, for things like, you know, women's rights and so on. I thought it was interesting that Liz said that it was in 1977 that the UN decided to back International Women's Day, and I thought that's not really a coincidence, because the 70s was a time when governments were taking these things more seriously, even though of course they didn't really support them in the sort of way that we would. And perhaps a good place to finish is with, all the legislation that came in the 70s under the Labour government, which obviously the Equal Pay Act and Sex Discrimination Act in particular were clearly favouring women. But if you actually look at the origins of the Equal Pay Act, it's a very interesting story. Some of you may have seen that recent programme on BBC4 about Dagenham. Did anybody see that? And that features the women who were involved in the sewing machinist dispute. And it was actually that dispute, although lots of people have been pressing for equal pay legislation for a long time, it was that dispute which actually provided a very deceitful spark on the part of one Barbara Castle, who was Minister of Labour at the time, in which she bought off these women who were on strike because they'd been totally discriminated against in a grading dispute. Ford was bringing a new grading structure, and they were given a B grade, whereas skilled workers were given a C grade. And in fact, there was one male sewing machinist who was given a C grade. So it was clear that this was skilled work, but they wouldn't give these women a C grade. And that was why they struck. But they saw it as a grading issue, and it was a grading issue. But it was taken up by a lot of feminists as being an actual equal pay issue. It's hard to sort of, But what I'm really trying to say is that women workers will get into struggle as workers. They don't necessarily wave their flag over sort of feminist issues, but these things, of course, will open them up to the, to fighting for, equal treatment for women. But in fact, the Equal Pay Act, as I say, was actually introduced as a little bit of, how can I put it, a bit of arm twisting, a deceptive piece of arm twisting by the Labour government, in which they said, well, we're bringing an Equal Pay Act, and of course we'll get a tribunal to look at your claim if you'll only get back to work, because those 300 odd women had more or less, they certainly brought the whole of Ford's to a halt through their strike, and they had the Prime Minister, God knows how many Labour politicians sort of frantically tearing their hair out just to get these 360 odd women back to work. And it was also a magnificent example of solidarity between women, because it was the women from Dagenham who came out first, and they got the women from Halewood to join in. And there was a myth that the men didn't support them, but if you look at it in detail, the men did support them over that. So that's a story I've told elsewhere, but I think it's a story that tells us that class struggle and women's liberation, for want of a better word or phrase, go together. Okay.
Okay, next Mary Parton.